welcome back everyone to another great episode of The Human Role. Thank you all so much for listening to so many past episodes this season. It's been really, really great to see everyone's support along the way. Wanted to start this segment out with just saying, look, we are in the year-end season. And so if you all need any type of HCM support, so that means from not only payroll and taxes, but any type of HR, any type of HRIS or implementation support, project management support, please feel free to either send me a note directly or go and visit my website. The link is right here below and send a note through there. I'd be happy to assist you myself and then also have a team under me that can step in and support as well. So if you need any type of like year-end support, whether it's now or even throughout, into next year too. I know right now it's heavy into audits, heavy into open enrollment season. I'd be happy to, support you all or, send you over some resumes to get some of my team members to support you all as well. So with that being said, we are into another great episode. I wanted to talk about tax registration support because this is something that I have noticed over the years is really prevalent and really important and necessary for companies. However, it's not necessarily something that people actually think about. So I wanted to get into that specific topic and talk about what tax registration, even is, what it looks like, why it's important, and then kind of give you some pointers as to how to properly go about it and making sure that you're staying in compliance. So let's start off with what tax registration is, why it isn't important for a company to even tend to, right? And when you think about tax registration, think about establishing your company as its own entity. Think about, its own identity. A lot of times it is really, really important to make sure that first you're filing or at least creating your business name and getting an FEIN through the IRS. So FEIN is a federal employer identification number. A lot of times you'll also hear it be called like EIN, just taking the F off of federal, and then it's your EIN, your employer identification number. That number is essentially your company's like social security number. So if you think about how you need your social, right, to get a bank account and so forth, to apply for a job, that's the same with your company, right? Your FEIN is essentially your social security number for your business. You need that to hire employees. You definitely need that to open up a business bank account. You need your FEIN to make sure you're filing your taxes accordingly. So it is really, really critical. It appears on your W-2s. It's something that identifies and connects your business. It separates your business from others. So when you're filing for your FEIN, of course, your name has to get approved as well. So if you've never been through this process, I will put the link to the IRS's website on where you can go below and also in the comment section for you to go and apply for your EIN. It's a fairly simple process. Doesn't take too long. I know that a lot of times people do prefer to hire like an accounting team, hire someone to file. Of course, you can always hire myself and my team to apply for FEIN if needed, but it is a really simple process. So if you're open to just going to the link and following the questionnaire that you need to go through to fill in and get your FEIN, it really happens pretty quickly. Unless the name isn't available, the IRS typically does spit out your EIN pretty quickly. But separately from that, you also need to establish your business with the states that you're in. So please keep in mind that depending upon, maybe you're in one state, maybe you're in multiple states, you absolutely need to apply and register through the Secretary of State for every single state. And then that's when it gets a little bit convoluted. A lot of times the Secretary of State will take 3 to 5 business days, maybe a little bit longer, maybe a little bit shorter, to respond back and let you know if the name is available, and then they will give you your state ID number. And that just kind of solidifies you and validates you within that specific state. There's also a lot of times where when you're filing through the state, you may have to list out like 2 or 3 other options of names just in case the first name isn't available. And there's ways that you can check to see, if a name is available. I mean, you can just do a simple Google search to see, if there's other names. That's, personal experience. That's what I did when I was going through my process to figure out, okay, I had a couple of other names in mind. I was like Google searching to see who had those names. Sometimes people don't keep up, you have to pay every single year to keep those names active. So sometimes people don't keep up with that. So it may be a name that might have expired. So a lot of times when you're going through the Secretary of State registration, that may take a few days. So outside of federal, you will establish, your FEIN, social security number, right through the IRS. Then you'll go to your state login and you'll register for the Secretary of State. That login is a registration is going to be different, obviously, for every single state. I'll also list the link to a heavy HCM provider that actually has something on their website that kind of helps break it down for you to make it easier. A lot of times it may route you to the proper state link. So that can be really, really helpful as well when you're trying to register for that. When you're going through this specific process, it will ask you to select specifically like what your company is. Are you going to be selling products? Is this going to be advisory support? Because you will need to narrow down to specific coding, right, as to what your business is doing, especially because this now will tie into if you even need to register for sales tax, right? And so from our stance, from like an HCM stance, you need your EIN. You need your state income tax number because that ties back to filing. But also there are some states that also require a state unemployment ID number, right? And so for those state unemployment ID numbers, that also varies for states. Some states, you all do not have unemployment. So like Florida, is one of the states where you wouldn't have to pay for unemployment. And so you may not ever have to apply for an ID number. But then there are other states, majority of states that do have unemployment that you have to pay into. And so their requirements are different. Sometimes you have to apply, whether you just have one employee. Some states say, hey, look, don't apply for unemployment unless you have 3 or 4 employees. It varies. There's a lot of different various laws when it comes to states, right? So make sure you are studying what your state law specifies, because then if we get into the nitty gritty, then locals come into play. And so not every state, not every city, not every county has a local tax to where, you have to apply for a local ID. But that is something that comes up in certain states. So if you've been in this industry for quite some time, you already understand Pennsylvania has heavy locals. Ohio also has locals. So there's something like that. Those are the states that probably have really heavy, heavy locals. But, there are other states that may not have any localities. But again, when you're applying for those locals, please understand that that also ties into the employees' addresses, who you are hiring. So there are sometimes when you're hiring someone in the system, if you do have a really good HCM provider that can recognize someone's address and can link that to what local applies there, that's going to be really, really critical that you pay attention to those pop-ups that come up in the system. If your HCM provider does not do that, then I just want to make clear that there is a local lookup. And so the link that I'll also provide to you all from this HCM provider that I typically refer to every now and then will be really, really good, because that's where you can look up someone's zip code and it'll tell you which local may apply to them. And that is really critical. So I will say it is great to stay on top of these things, just making sure that you're abiding by the law, because if you're not, why registering is so important is because it keeps you into compliance, keeps you out of trouble, keeps you away from getting any types of penalties, because these penalties can be pretty critical. It also, if you look at an example where, say, you don't have an unemployment ID number, or say you're not filing your unemployment properly, and then you lay off someone and someone goes to file for unemployment, if the state does not see any funds in there, but you are a company that should have been sending funds to them, that could also be an issue. So that's going to trigger an audit. You're going to start getting notices. Your employee's going to be upset because they want to collect their, unemployment and they can't. So then that just can become like a domino effect. So these are things for everyone to make sure that as you're running a business, you're really, really paying attention to. As you're in the HR and payroll seat, specifically for a business, you really want to just make sure you're also doing your due diligence, checking those audits, making sure those are properly in play, because registering correctly from the very beginning is really, really important when you're going through this specific process. So I wanted to make sure I stress that, as that is why this process is really important, and to make sure you get the registration right, like upfront, because if you do something and if you check the wrong box, if you check the wrong coding or classification code or what your business is, yes, you can always change it later, but going through the paperwork to get that done, sometimes it's not as easy, especially when you're going to the IRS. If you've ever had to call the IRS, when you're calling them, you're waiting on hold for forever. A lot of times they require forms to be sent in. And a lot of times these forms have to be literally manually printed, filled in, and then manually shipped to them, right? So that could always cause an issue down the line. So that's the first steps of, specifically what tax registration is, but then also why it's important for yourself, whether you're running a business or whether you're working for a company, why it's important to make sure that if the responsibility falls on you to apply for these ID numbers, that you're doing it correctly and making sure you're asking all the proper questions because it is a very critical process. And you might be wondering who needs to specifically register, right? So any type of entity. So we're talking about like sole proprietorships, LLCs, partnerships, corporations. All of those have different breakdowns as far as how they're taxed. I know like partnerships are taxed differently than an LLC, the same for like corporations as well. So it is critical that if your business is going to fall in line with any of this, that you make sure that you're registering and of course getting your EIN and then properly registering for the state and the localities. What I do want to also note is that if you're unsure which one to select for your business, when you're going through the process and when you're having to kind of select whether you're going to be a sole proprietorship, maybe it's you and someone else going into business together. Should you be a partnership or, should you just go solo with your LLC corporation? When you're registering through the IRS's website, it'll have those different like breakdowns and descriptions for you. But sometimes it can be kind of scary because it is really, like I mentioned just a moment ago, it is really hard once you've selected one thing to change over to another. It's not something that, you can't do, right? It is something that you absolutely can do. Plenty of people do that, especially as your business grows. But it is really important just to make sure that you initially at least start off with on the right foot and select the right thing. That's when I would say reach out to an accountant, right? And get some opinion if you can. If you have someone you can just ping, maybe you have someone already and you can reach out to. If not, I would say just kind of call around and try to get, an intake call and ask those proper questions, do proper research as well. You can, there's lots of researches online where you can do to kind of check in to see which one might be best suitable for you before you actually click the button and register, because these are all really important, critical things when you get into things down the line. A lot of times people will rush through the registration process, not do all their proper research. And then when it comes time for like filing, at the end of the year, they may have wanted to have selected something different, right? And so then you have to start the change process. So if you have any specific questions about that, definitely reach out, because this really, when you select the right entity for yourself and when you're registering properly with, the IRS, with the states, with the localities, that really puts your company in a really good stance, right? It really establishes that you are a solid company, know what you're doing. And so people will really look at that, right? Because if you have a lot of tax issues, we can get into that in a little bit, but if you have a lot of tax issues, that's not a good thing. Not a good thing to have. So if you want to have a company that's an LLC, corporation, sole proprietorship, partnership, make sure that you are looking into details as to how each one of those is taxed and what that really looks like, and make sure you're studying that so you select the right option for yourself, because you don't want to have to go through the process down the line to change it over if you don't necessarily have to. So just, some advice from there. So let's get into the tax registration process, right? So we've already talked about making sure you get your EIN, making sure you get your state ID numbers, any type of localities, depending on the employees you're hiring. But let's really discuss like potential common hurdles, because when you're registering for these IDs, it's not sometimes always clear and always really cut and dry, especially if it's not your own company, but you're coming in and you're registering for these ID numbers kind of blindly. And so I want to speak to anyone who's in this seat. Even if you reach out and get help from someone, even if you reach out to your HCM provider, right? Because that's something that could commonly happen, and you have them support you with registering for these ID numbers. Some of them will actually submit your registrations, but I want to make clear you still have to provide these HCM providers or any other consultants that you may pull in with information from your company. So when you're registering for these IDs, a lot of times you will need ownership information. That does also include social security numbers. So I know that can be really sensitive. You do need to know like the start date of the actual entity. So if you're having someone come in and having them help you with like a specific audit, you need to know like the specific employees within those states, when they started, when the state should have been active all along, because you may be coming in and applying for the ID a little bit late. So there's a lot of information that you need to provide. And then also, are you a for-profit or a nonprofit, right? So for-profit and nonprofit registrations are different. A lot of times nonprofits need a lot more information. Sometimes, depending on the state, the nonprofit registrations could be really manual, could be a lot of paper forms. There's a lot of strict information that the states and the IRS do require. So wanted to just kind of notate that the registration process is not necessarily always a click of a button. So I know I mentioned earlier when you're going through and you're applying for your FEIN through the IRS, a lot of times that can be fairly simple. But if you're essentially once you start applying for every single state that you're in, maybe you're just in one state, maybe you're in multiple, that could be when you're getting into a lot more information, and they need to make sure that it's the proper dates. You don't want to lie about the dates. You don't want to guess about the dates. You don't want to apply too early. Sometimes I don't always suggest applying early, because what if you're anticipating that an employee is going to start in December and it's early November, and you start trying to prep for that registration and then that person pulls out. So maybe you now have a state ID number in that specific state, and then the person is no longer working for you. That could also be an issue. Sometimes you kind of want to wait until you know for a fact the person is either there in the door. Another thing for unemployment, I will say, is unemployment typically cannot be filed until after you've done your first payroll with that person on your payroll. So that's really critical to know, is that unemployment does require for like a payroll register to be sent in to show that you legitimately have an employee in this specific state. And that could also take some time. I say this to say is that if you're in the middle of a quarter, or more specifically, the end of a quarter, and you're trying to register for a new employee, a lot of times right now, especially within the time that we're in, a lot of states are backlogged. So a lot of times it is taking months to get these ID numbers in. And so if you're hiring someone at the end of, a specific quarter, and it's going to take that specific state 3 months to get you an ID number, you will have to put the state in your system under an applied for status. However, the caveat there is that some states don't actually allow for an applied for status. And a lot of HCM providers try to stay away from allowing that applied for status, because then they're pulling money each pay period, like unemployment money, state income tax money each pay period. They're holding it because there's not an ID number for them to identify once they send the funds over to the state. So it's just sitting there, and then it can take months upon months to get an ID number. Now, is that your fault? No, it's not our fault that the states are backlogged in that way. But I just want to say that and notate that, because that is a real life scenario that is repeatedly going on over and over with a lot of companies. I have seen it specifically over the last some odd years. So just know that if you are going through any type of mergers, if you are bringing on any type of new people, if you can, I know you always can't, but if you can, maybe hold on hiring someone at the end of a quarter and maybe hire them at the beginning of the quarter, or do a merger with the start date at the beginning of the quarter. So that way it allows you a couple of months before filings are due for you to get your ID numbers in place. That would be preferred and really, really critical. I would say best case scenario, right? If you could. Of course, we're not always that lucky. There's only a few states that I would say give you an ID number immediately. I think Georgia's one that gives you the state, Georgia state income tax immediately once you apply. But outside of that, most states, I'm telling you all, been in this seat for some years now with these tax registrations, it does take quite some time. And so just keep that in mind. Keep that in mind when you're going through the process, because the dates are really critical. And those are some really more so common hurdles. You want to, of course, make sure you have the proper information and that you're applying for everything correctly. Number one, checking all the right boxes, entering in all the right information, the right social security numbers for your owners. But definitely more so wanting to really make sure that the dates are lining up, so that if the state is backlogged and if it does take the states months to give you a number, you're not going to find yourself in a pickle and hold up your filing. But the last thing you want to do is get a notice from a state with penalty on late filing. That's just, if you've ever gotten that, you definitely don't want something like that going on. Definitely not under your watch. So just a nice little tidbit to keep in mind. Okay, so let's get into ongoing compliance and maintenance with keeping up with your ID numbers. So once you have your ID numbers in place, please understand that there's deposit frequencies, right? So some are semi-monthly, some are, monthly, depending on how large your payrolls are. You want to make sure that you're doing those deposits on time, right? And you want to make sure that you're not, delayed and that you're meeting those deposit frequencies, because that could also, cause some issues with you down the line. So if you're using an HCM provider, there are notices that will come through when you're given your ID number. That notice will have like your deposit frequency. So if you're doing it manually on your side, just make sure that you have your state registration login, your state login actually to every single state. So you can log in, you can do your deposits, make sure you're doing that and you're staying on top of your deposits, because that is something that will ding you. If not, if you are using an HCM provider and you're paying for their tax services, they would already be depositing your deposits on time, hopefully. But you need to make sure you're checking all the right forms, right? So just make sure at the end of every quarter, when you're getting those statement of deposits, that's why those SODs that you get from your HCM provider, make sure that you are reviewing that and making sure that they are depositing. I know a lot of times, myself included, we get comfortable with what our HCM providers are doing for us, and it doesn't seem like it's any issues, but you really want to make sure that you're staying on top of that, especially when you are assigning a new state, so that you don't have any issues down the line. Because once they start coming through the door, I would say like once you start getting like one audit by a specific state or, by the IRS, then it can just become a domino effect, right? Where other audits will slip through. So that's one thing to make sure you're keeping on top of. Make sure you're reviewing the forms, your 941s, your 940s. So for those of y'all who don't know, the 941 is your quarterly deposits, your 940 are your annual state unemployment deposits. So just make sure you're reviewing that. And then, of course, make sure you're doing a review of your employee W-2s before the end of the year. We're in November right now, so everyone should be doing it. I know all my good payroll peeps are doing that out there. So just make sure that you're keeping up to speed on that, because that could also, tie into a lot of, incorrect payroll data, but also just making sure your filings are handled properly too. And then another thing to also talk about is just managing like the changes for your like employees, right? So in this day and age, it's not unlikely that an employee is going to relocate and move to another state, especially if you have like remote employees and they're moving from state to state. A lot of times in HCM systems, when an employee changes their address in the actual system, it doesn't necessarily alert HR, payroll, or force someone to change the state that is coded on the employee's like pay profile, right? And so if the employee doesn't notify their manager that they moved, or maybe they did notify their manager, but their manager doesn't know, they need to let HR know or payroll know, so that you all can then change over their state in the system. That's when you're going to find yourself in a pickle. And so I'm sure anyone out there who has been in this industry has experienced this before, where an employee has moved states, especially during COVID, where an employee has moved a state and has not notified anybody, right, that they have moved, and it's become like this big issue now. And now you find out they moved 3 months ago. You're at the end of another quarter, you've got to either change their state in the system, or this is a whole new state where you don't even have an ID. So then here you are, you got to register for their state ID number, and that could cause an issue, right? And timing could come into factors where that could be an issue. But just making sure that you're managing that and auditing that, right? You can always run a census report pulling like an employee's address. You don't even have to pull like their full address. You can just pull their one state code where they from their address, and then also pull their state tax code, right? That is on their payroll profile, and just do a spot check, right? And then from there, identify who has moved state. So, I mean, obviously that's easier said than done. I'm saying it like, oh yeah, just do that audit every month. I mean, we don't really have time to do that. But if you can find time to do that, that would be great. Obviously, that would save you a lot of headache in case if something like that comes up down the line. Or another thing is to try to set up some type of like workflow in the system for when people do change over their estates, just have like a workflow, like notify certain members on the HR team of that. So that's another way to look at it. But I did want to kind of point that out, just making sure you're maintaining that type of compliance on a go forward basis. Because there's a lot of one off nuances that people do not realize that if they change it on their profile, that it really affects the payroll side of things, right? And so it is really critical just to make sure that we do our due diligence as much as possible and auditing as much as we possibly can. And then if you need, any type of supports with audits, you can always reach out to me and my team. We can always help you as well, get ahead of that and kind of keep up with that every single month and every single year. And, you really want to just make sure that you are keeping up with that, just because the risk of not keeping up with that and not being in compliance, the late filings, the penalties and interest that could come through could be really damaging. And a lot of times, especially if you're running a smaller company, could really be a key factor on whether you can stay in business or not. I mean, that's just, I've seen a lot of companies fall into tax issues or be trying to evade taxes, right? And it's like, I told you all in past episodes, don't even do it. Just pay your taxes. As painful as it is sometimes, just pay it, please. So yeah, so you want to just make sure that you keep up with that, just making sure you're constantly running audits as much as you possibly can. Maybe put that into like your SOP every single quarter, or maybe every single 6 months, twice a year, middle of the year, before the end of the year. So that way you're at least not getting too far off and you're not waiting until like November, December, right before your last payroll, right before W-2s are about to go out for you to discover something, because that's when it could be really damaging. And let's get into now like digital transformation, when it comes to tax registration. Because if you've seen some past AI episodes that I posted, this is also like automating this is also a factor when it comes to the HCM side of space. I know that there's a lot of HCM providers putting out these alerts. What I mentioned earlier too, when you're adding in a new employee, if you're using an HCM provider that does have this heavily built in their back end, they're going to send out an alert to let you know, hey, look, there's a local that should be on this employee's profile, so that you hopefully don't have to always go back and go into like the local lookups and try to figure out if this local applies to this employee's address. So there's a lot of that going on with AI. So I have not seen that AI is going to fix this registration piece. And when I mean that, I mean by every single state that is backlogged by months. I've not seen yet a solution that would help overcome that, just because during COVID, there were so many people, everyone knows that you've seen it on the news, right? That were doing a lot of these fake companies, that a lot of these states became a lot stricter, right? They got the lockdown on their processes. And so I've not seen that yet. But as far as like making sure your deposits are on time, as far as making sure the dashboards are showing you all types of alerts when you're late on a filing, when money is due, when you're still missing an ID number, and the quarter's about to end and they're about to file the end of the quarterly report and they need your ID number. All of those alerts in the system are heavily set up in HCMs right now. I see it every single day. And so I'm in multiple HCM systems across the board. So just know that a lot of that digital transformation is happening. So if you are new in a seat and you're not sure what the prior person was doing ahead of you, I would say just make sure you are reviewing the dashboards, running reports, trying to audit yourself to catch as much as you possibly can, because that's going to be really, really critical. Because a lot of these little one-off nuances, like if you just give your HCM provider a SUI ID number that they have been missing for, say, the past 2 quarters, that's going to solve a lot of your issues, right? That's going to solve a lot of the tax notices that are coming through. If you have SUI rate changes that are coming through, maybe the rates hadn't been updated, over the last couple of quarters, that's going to solve a lot of that, right? And a lot of times these HCM providers, depending on the one that you're working with, actually they get like full loads from the states on the new ID numbers for your specific company. So another thing to note is that when you are applying for these state IDs and you're adding in the state IDs into your HCM provider, a lot of times these states require like a POA form, like power of attorney form, or like a tax authorization form that you also have to send through, allowing the states to accept a deposit from your HCM provider. And so that connects the dots. So a lot of times the states will communicate directly to your HCM provider on your new unemployment rates. So that way that automatically gets updated in the system. So there's a lot of back end, digital transformation that is happening in this space to kind of help make our lives a lot easier. And so I just wanted to notate that because lots of good things coming down the pipeline to help us keep up with things so that we're not having to just manually go through one by one, every single time. So yeah, go back and look at some of the past episodes with AI if you've not yet, just to kind of get an idea of what is happening out there and what's happening in our HCM space. There's lots of good information to kind of just know and keep up on, especially to kind of know how to help grow your career and help get you to the next level and what it really looks like versus what we're doing today and how different it's going to look like, in the future. And lastly, I just wanted to end out with, some helpful tips. I would say just making sure you're keeping up with tax laws, keeping in good standing with your HCM providers, your account managers, so that you're staying in compliance. A lot of your providers will have relationship managers that will have a lot of good information for you to pay attention to. Another thing is tax consultants like myself and my team. So definitely reach out. I would say having like a consultant on your side, even if it's not someone that is on a retainer every single month, but someone that you could just pull in, maybe once a month or once a quarter for a few hours just to do a quick audit and spot checks would be really, really good to just keep up with. That's always really helpful because once you're in your HR and payroll seat, you have your everyday, day-to-day that goes through. And it's natural to not be able to stop and set and focus on a specific audit, right? Especially if, you have thousands of employees that are across thousands of locations. So make sure you are asking for help. You can still own your space and still know how to do your job, but also just, have a helping hand there, for you and for your specific team. So those are always good things to definitely keep in mind. And then on top of that, also just making sure you're using resources. So you can go to the IRS's site directly and find lots of information. I know sometimes it could be too much information, but that's really good to just kind of keep in your back pocket. Also, I'll have some links here that I'll share with you on HCM providers that have lots of good information on their sites for not only the IRS, but also for every single individual state. Make sure that you are keeping up with those states. Make sure that you even have your email plugged in to get notified through every single state's websites, right? So that's how you'll know like the new leave laws that come through, new unemployment tax rates that come through, maybe any type of tax credits, anything of that sort. Just making sure you're frequently getting notified when updates come through and just reading, staying, part of the laws and having your network, right? Keeping a village of people, of HR and payroll people around you, keeping the right, whether it's like councils, whether it's accounting teams, right? CPAs, good CPAs to kind of help notify you of certain things. Those are all really good things to kind of keep up to speed on. It's one of those things where there's so much information going on and so much to get into when you talk about tax registration that you want to make sure you're staying up to speed on it. So want to give that tidbit, but thank you all so much for listening in on all of my insight when it comes to tax registration. Please know that it is really, really critical you keep up with your taxes. I don't want you to find yourself in a pickle. So if you need any help, definitely reach out to me directly. I'd be happy to support you in any way, shape, or form. And I hope this explanation helped, but I also hope the links that I provide really help you kind of get you along the way. I'm happy to provide any type of like guidance or advisory too, just in general. If you just have like some quick questions, just ping me and send me a note. But next up, we have another great episode. And we also next up have another great guest, but I will not spoil that just right now. So stay tuned for more. Thank you all so much for liking, listening, making it to the end of this video. And cheers to a year end. I know we're all out there grinding it out. So hope everyone's year end and open enrollment season is going well. And I will see you all in a couple of weeks. Bye.